The sun had long set by the time Sarah's car rolled onto the gravel driveway of the Countryside Airbnb. Her headlights swept across the house, illuminating its facade in fleeting detail. The house was a two-story structure with peeling white paint and windows that seemed unnervingly dark, as though they swallowed any light that touched them. Despite its charm in the pictures she'd seen online, it now looked forlorn and uninviting, a stark contrast to the cozy retreat Sarah had envisioned when booking. Stepping out of the car, she pulled her coat tighter around her to ward off the autumn chill. Her breath misted in the air, and the silence of the countryside felt oppressive. There were no sounds of nocturnal animals, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness. She hesitated, glancing back at the road. The long driveway wound through dense trees, and beyond them lay nothing but darkness. She shook off the creeping unease and grabbed her suitcase from the trunk. The porch light flickered weakly as she approached, casting long, uneven shadows across the steps. She knocked on the door, her knuckles sounding hollow against the wood. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. After a pause, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood there. The woman's face was pale, her skin stretched thin over high cheekbones. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her eyes, an unnervingly bright shade of blue, seemed to pierce right through Sarah. "You must be Sarah," the woman said, her voice gravelly but soft, almost melodic. "Come in. The night air can be quite unforgettable." Sarah offered a polite smile, stepping inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her, but it wasn't comforting. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. The interior was dimly lit, the wallpaper faded and peeling in spots. Knickknacks cluttered every available surface: porcelain figurines, antique clocks, and dusty picture frames displaying blurred, unrecognizable faces. "I'm Mrs. Whitaker," the woman said, her gaze lingering on Sarah for a moment too long. "Your room is upstairs, last door on the right. Breakfast is at 8 sharp. Don't miss it." Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Whitaker turned and disappeared down a narrow hallway, her footsteps silent despite the creaking floorboard. Feeling unsettled, Sarah picked up her suitcase and climbed the staircase. The wood groaned beneath her weight, the sound amplified in the quiet house. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit by a single bulb at the far end, casting elongated shadows that seemed to sway unnaturally. Her room was simple but tidy: a neatly made bed, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the dark expanse of the countryside. She placed her suitcase on the bed and began unpacking. As she did, her eyes fell on a leather-bound journal resting on the desk. Curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up and flipped through the yellowed pages. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places. "I don't know how much longer I can endure this. The house is alive. It watches, it whispers, and it takes." Sarah frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to the next entry. "The guests never leave. They think they can, but the house doesn't let them. Neither can I." The entries became more erratic, the writing frantic and scrawled. The last page was smeared with something dark, almost black, but it looked suspiciously like dried blood. A sudden creak outside her door made her jump. She whipped around, staring at the door, as the creak turned into soft, deliberate footsteps. They stopped just outside her room. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. After a long moment, she cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, but a chill ran down her spine as she noticed something strange. The light bulb at the far end was now swinging gently, casting shifting shadows along the walls. "Maybe it's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though she knew that didn't make sense. The windows were all closed. She locked her door and climbed into bed, but sleep eluded her. Every sound, the creaking of the house, the faint rustle of the wind, seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. And then the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, but they grew louder. A chorus of voices speaking in hushed tones, overlapping and incomprehensible. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to come from the walls surrounding her. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The whispers ceased. She sat in the silence, her breaths ragged. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room. She screamed, clutching the blankets tightly around her. The knock came again, this time from the window. Summoning every ounce of courage, she got out of bed and approached the window. Peering out, she saw nothing but darkness. The reflection of her own pale face stared back at her, her wide eyes filled with fear. When morning finally came, Sarah felt like she hadn't slept at all. She decided to confront Mrs. Whitaker, determined to find some explanation for the night's events. But when she descended the stairs, she found the house eerily empty. "Mrs. Whitaker?" she called out. No answer. Her search led her to a door she hadn't noticed the night before. A small, unassuming door at the end of the hallway. It creaked open to reveal a steep staircase descending into darkness. Despite the pit of dread in her stomach, Sarah felt compelled to go down. The steps groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. The basement was lit by a single bulb that flickered weakly. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars containing murky, unidentifiable substance. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay a collection of photographs. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the faces in the photos. They were the same faces from the picture frames upstairs, but now they looked terrified, their eyes wide with horror. Her own face stared back at her from the most recent photograph, taken while she had been asleep. A creak from the stairs made her whirl around. Mrs. Whitaker stood at the top, her expression calm, but her eyes gleaming with something sinister. "You shouldn't have come down here," she said, her voice cold. Sarah backed away, her heart hammering. "What is this? What are you doing?" Mrs. Whitaker descended slowly, the shadows around her seeming to writhe and twist unnaturally. "The house has its rules, and so do I." The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The shadows in the corners of the basement began to move, taking on twisted humanoid forms. Panicking, Sarah grabbed the nearest object, a rusted pipe, and swung it at the light bulb. The room plunged into darkness, and she sprinted up the stairs, the shadows and whispers chasing her. She burst out of the house, her screams echoing into the morning air. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. When the police arrived hours later, they found the house abandoned. There was no sign of Mrs. Whitaker, no photographs, no journal, just an empty, decaying shell of a home. Sarah never used Airbnb again, and even years later, she could still hear the whispers in her dreams. Kevin had been looking forward to his weekend getaway for weeks. The stress of work and city life had worn him down, and a sleek, modern Airbnb in the countryside seemed like the perfect escape. The listing had promised serenity and style, a minimalist house with panoramic views, luxurious amenities, and an artistic twist that intrigued him. The artistic twist turned out to be mirrors. The house was filled with them. Mirrors lined the walls of the living room, gleamed on the ceiling of the bedroom, and even covered the sliding doors leading to the patio. At first, Kevin found it odd but impressive. The mirrors made the house feel expansive, as if it stretched infinitely in every direction. "Architectural genius," he muttered to himself as he unpacked. The first day passed uneventfully. Kevin lounged on the patio, enjoyed the countryside view, and cooked a simple dinner in the modern kitchen. By nightfall, he was curled up on the plush leather sofa, watching a movie on the massive flat-screen TV. It wasn't until he turned the TV off and caught his reflection in the darkened screen that something felt off. His reflection lingered a second too long. Kevin blinked and stared, chalking it up to exhaustion or his imagination. He shook his head, turned off the lights, and headed to bed. The next morning, sunlight flooded the house, bouncing off the mirrors and making the space feel even brighter. Kevin prepared breakfast and laughed at himself for being spooked the night before. He spent the day exploring the surrounding countryside, taking photos, and enjoying the peaceful isolation. But by the time night fell again, the unease returned. While brushing his teeth in the bathroom, Kevin noticed something strange. The reflection of the hallway behind him in the mirror didn't match reality. The hallway in the mirror was slightly darker, and the door to his bedroom, clearly closed in real life, was ajar in the reflection. He froze, staring at the mirror. A shiver ran down his spine as he watched the bedroom door in the reflection slowly swing open. When he spun around, the door was closed. Kevin's stomach twisted in knots. He tried to rationalize. "Mirrors can distort things," he muttered, though his voice trembled. He forced himself to bed, but found it hard to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt like he was being watched. He cracked one eye open and glanced at the mirror opposite the bed. That's when he saw it. His reflection was staring at him, even though he was lying on his side with his back to the mirror. Kevin shot up, his heart pounding in his chest. The reflection mirrored his movement immediately, but now its expression was different. Its eyes were wide, its mouth slightly open, as if it were gasping for breath. "Stop it," Kevin whispered to himself, squeezing his eyes shut. "You're imagining." When he opened his eyes again, his reflection was back to normal. Shaken, he left the lights on for the rest of the night. The next day, Kevin debated leaving early, but decided to stay. He convinced himself that he was overreacting. It was a trick of light, maybe a quirk in the design of the house. He just needed to relax. But as the hours passed, the mirrors began to feel oppressive. Every time he glanced at one, he felt as though the reflections were moving just slightly out of sync. At first, it was subtle. His hand would rise to scratch his head, and the reflection would follow half a second later. But by evening, the movements became more pronounced. In the kitchen, while chopping vegetables, he looked up at the mirror over the counter and froze. His reflection was standing perfectly still, staring at him with an expression of pure malice. Kevin stumbled back, dropping the knife. "What the hell?" The reflection smiled. a slow, deliberate smile that sent ice through his veins. Without thinking, Kevin grabbed a dishcloth and flung it over the mirror. The smile disappeared beneath the fabric, but he felt no relief. The oppressive atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier, the silence almost deafening. That night, Kevin decided to sleep on the couch, far from the bedroom mirror. He dozed off with the TV playing softly in the background. A faint tapping sound woke him in the early hours. He sat up, groggy, and looked around. The tapping continued, soft, rhythmic, and coming from the mirror-covered sliding doors to the patio. Kevin approached cautiously, his heart thundering in his chest. Peering out, he saw only darkness beyond the glass. But in the reflection, he saw a figure standing outside, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. The figure tilted its head as if studying him. Kevin stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the sliding doors began to rattle violently, as if something were trying to force its way inside. Kevin grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle, but the rattling stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, Kevin looked up at the mirrors. His reflection wasn't there anymore. The next few hours were a blur of panic and dread. Kevin tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut. It was as if the house itself was holding him captive. Desperate, he grabbed a heavy vase and smashed the nearest mirror. The sound was deafening, the shards scattering across the floor. But instead of relief, Kevin felt a wave of nausea. The shattered mirror revealed a gaping void, an endless darkness that seemed to pull at it. From the void, the shadowy figure emerged, stepping into the room with unnatural fluidity. Kevin stumbled back, his screams caught in his throat. The figure reached for him, its hand elongated and claw-like. The next morning, the cleaning crew arrived to prepare the house for the next guest. They found no trace of Kevin, except for a single photograph on the living room table. In the photo, Kevin stood inside the house, his face pressed against the inside of a mirror, his expression one of frozen terror. The house went back on Airbnb later that week, its reviews glowing as ever. No one questioned why every guest who stayed there eventually vanished without a trace. Emma had always been a traveler, her wanderlust fueled by desire to escape the monotony of her everyday life. She loved staying in unique Airbnbs, especially old homes with character and history. When she found a listing for a historic Victorian mansion nestled in a quiet New England town, she couldn't resist. The pictures showed a charming, beautifully restored house with intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and sprawling gardens. The host's description was enticing. Experience the past, enchanting home, enjoy the serene atmosphere and timeless beauty. However, please respect the house rule, particularly the one about the locked room on the third floor. The mention of the locked room piqued Emma's curiosity, but she shrugged it off. Rules were rules. She arrived late in the afternoon, greeted by the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the house. The mansion was even more impressive in person. The ornate detailing on the exterior, the wraparound porch, and the towering turrets gave it a storybook charm. The host, a pleasant middle-aged man named Mr. Caldwell, met her at the door. His warm smile and firm handshake put her at ease. "Welcome, Emma," he said, holding the door open for her. "I hope you'll find everything to your liking. Feel free to explore the house, but please remember the third-floor room is off limits." "Of course," Emma replied, though her curiosity about the room grew. The first evening was uneventful. Emma spent her time marveling at the antique furniture, the creaking floorboards, and the ornate fireplaces in nearly every room. She felt as if she'd stepped back in time, and she loved every minute of it. As night fell, the house grew quieter, too quiet. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't natural. It felt as though the house was listening, waiting. She chalked it up to her overactive imagination and went to bed. The next morning, Emma explored the ground, strolling through the gardens, admiring the old stone fountain. By afternoon, a light rain began to fall, and she retreated back inside. As she sat in the living room with a book, she noticed something odd. The air had grown colder. The fireplace, which had been crackling warmly earlier, was now cold and dark. She got up to investigate but stopped when she heard a faint sound. Footsteps, faint and deliberate, coming from the floor above her. Emma froze, listening intently. The footsteps moved slowly, creaking across the ceiling. "Probably just the house settling," she muttered to herself, though her voice wavered. But when the footsteps stopped directly above her, her heart began to race. "That's the third floor," she realized. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was her imagination. But as the evening wore on, the sense of unease deepened. By nightfall, Emma's curiosity had gotten the better of her. She climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. The third-floor staircase loomed ahead, narrow and steep. A faint draft wafted down from above, carrying with it a faint musty odor. The door to the locked room was at the end of the third-floor hallway, its dark wood and iron latch standing out against the faded wallpaper. Emma approached slowly, her pulse quickening. The closer she got, the colder the air became. She reached out to touch the door, and her fingers recoiled at the icy surface. A faint sound drifted through the wood. Soft whispers, too muffled to understand. She pressed her ear to the door. The whispers grew louder, urgent, like a chorus of voices speaking over one another. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. Emma stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "Okay, that's enough," she whispered, turning to flee. But as she descended the stairs, she heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't coming from the door. They were coming from all around her, following her as she hurried back to her room. That night, Emma barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt a presence in the room. The whispers continued, faint but persistent, just on the edge of her hearing. At some point, she woke to the sensation of being watched. She opened her eyes and gasped. A figure stood at the foot of her bed, a woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil of matted hair. Emma blinked, and the figure was gone. Terrified, she turned on every light in the room and stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, Emma decided to confront Mr. Caldwell. She found him in the kitchen, calmly sipping coffee. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He looked at her with a strange expression, a mix of pity and guilt. "I told you not to go near the third-floor room." "I didn't go in," Emma protested, "but something was trying to get out." Mr. Caldwell sighed, setting down his mug. "That room is complicated. It's best if you leave today. I won't charge you for the extra nights." Emma was stunned. "What's in there? What's happening in this house?" Mr. Caldwell didn't answer. He simply handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Some things are better left alone." Emma packed her things and left, but the experience haunted her. She couldn't shake the memory of the whispers, the icy air, or the figure at the foot of her bed. Months later, she stumbled across an article online about the house. It mentioned its history, specifically the third-floor room. 100 years ago, the family who owned the house had locked their eldest daughter, Eleanor, in that room. She had been troubled, the article said, prone to violent outbursts and strange behavior. The family had hoped isolation would cure her. Instead, it drove her mad. Eleanor died in the room, and ever since, every occupant of the house reported strange occurrences. Some claimed to hear her whispers. Others swore they saw her in the mirrors or felt her cold touch in the night. Emma closed her laptop, her hands trembling. She couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor had tried to reach her and that somehow she might have succeeded. To this day, Emma refuses to stay in any home with a locked room. Alex had been backpacking across Europe for weeks, hopping from hostel to hostel and Airbnb to Airbnb. His latest stop was a small, picturesque village in the French countryside. He had booked a room in a centuries-old stone cottage that looked quaint and inviting in the photos. The host, Claudine, had glowing reviews, with guests praising her warm hospitality and the charming rustic ambiance of the home. When Alex arrived, the cottage seemed even more idyllic in person. Ivy crept up the stone walls, and colorful flower boxes adorned the windowsill. The air smelled of lavender and fresh bread, and Claudine greeted him with a bright smile and a thick French accent. "Welcome, Alex," she said, her tone cheerful. "You will love it here. The nights are so peaceful." She showed him to his room, which was cozy and decorated with vintage furniture. A canopy bed, lace curtains, and a small wooden desk gave the space an old-world charm. Claudine mentioned she lived in the cottage's back section, separated from the guest quarters by a locked door. "If you need anything, just knock on the door." Alex nodded, feeling reassured by her kindness. The first evening passed uneventfully. Alex explored the village, enjoyed a meal at a local cafe, and returned to the cottage just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The soft glow of lanterns lit the streets, and the peaceful atmosphere lulled him to a sense of calm. Back in his room, he unpacked his things and settled in for the night. The quiet was almost unnerving after the constant noise of cities and hostels, but Alex told himself it was a welcome change. It wasn't until midnight that he first heard it. A soft knock at his door. It was faint, barely audible, but distinct enough to jolt him awake. Groggy, Alex sat up in bed and glanced at the clock. 12:03 a.m. "Claudine?" he called out, his voice thick with sleep. No answer. He got up, hesitating before approaching the door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. Shrugging it off as a dream or a creak of the old house, he returned to bed. But just as he was drifting back to sleep, the knock came again. This time, it was louder. Alex's heart raced. He got up again and opened the door quickly, hoping to catch whoever was there. Once again, the hallway was empty. The next morning, Alex mentioned the strange noises to Claudine. "Ah, it is an old house," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Sometimes it makes noises in the night. Do not worry. Her smile was warm, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease that she quickly masked. Alex let it go, chalking up the events to his imagination, the quirks of an old home. The second night, Alex fell asleep easily, comforted by the thought that the noises were harmless. But at midnight he woke again, this time to the sound of footsteps outside his door. Soft, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth. "Claudine?" he called out again, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Summoning his courage, Alex opened the door. The hallway was empty, but something was different this time. A faint, sickly sweet smell hung in the air, like decaying flowers. The atmosphere felt oppressive, the shadows in the corners of the hallway darker than they should have been. Alex shut the door and locked it, his pulse pounding. He climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. Moments later, the footsteps resumed. This time, Alex bolted upright, his eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The air felt colder, and the smell of decay grew stronger. Then, he saw it, a figure standing in the corner near the desk. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure didn't move, but Alex could feel its gaze boring into him. He froze, unable to look away. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure took a slow, shuffling step forward. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Alex scrambled out of bed and backed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Claudine!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure paused, then tilted its head again, as if mocking him. Slowly, it raised a bony hand and pointed at the locked door, separating the guest quarters from Claudine's section of the house. Alex didn't wait to see what would happen next. He grabbed his phone and bolted out of the room, sprinting down the hallway and out of the cottage. The next morning, Alex returned with the local police. He explained what had happened, though he could tell they were skeptical. When they entered the house, it was empty. Claudine was nowhere to be found, and her section of the cottage was eerily pristine, as though no one had lived there in years. In Alex's room, the police found scratches on the walls and strange, dark stains on the floorboards. They couldn't explain them, but they assured Alex there was no immediate danger. Alex left the cottage that day, shaken and unable to make sense of what he had experienced. Weeks later, he searched for the Airbnb listing out of morbid curiosity. It was gone. No trace of Claudine or the cottage remained online, as if they had never existed. But sometimes late at night, Alex would hear soft knocks on his apartment door. No one was ever there when he left, but the faint, sickly sweet smell of decaying flowers always lingered in the air.